The Gaza Strip remains the most dangerous place in the world to be a child, and day after day that brutal reality is reinforced. Over the past 48 hours, the largest remaining fully functional hospital in Gaza has been shelled twice. Now that hospital, Al Nasser in Khan Yunis, was a hospital I was at on a daily basis. It not only shelters large numbers of children who have brutal wounds of war, but it also shelters hundreds and hundreds of women and children from across the Gaza Strip who are simply seeking safety. Over the weekend, UNICEF had shared the story of a 13-year-old girl called Dina. Now, when Dina's house in Khan Yunis was completely destroyed, her mother and her father and her two brothers were killed. Dina survived, but she was badly injured and had her leg amputated. Somehow, Dina had not lost hope. She told us about her dreams, about being a lawyer. Her quote was, "I feel injustice. When I grow up, I'll become a lawyer so I can enjoy my rights and the rights of all children." Dina was one of those killed in the shelling of Nasser Hospital on Sunday, the day after she shared her story of hope. So where do children and families go? They're not safe in hospitals, they're not safe in shelters, and they're certainly not safe in so-called safe zones. So let me just spend a minute explaining why these safe zones are anything but. Parties to the conflict have an obligation to take all feasible precautions to protect the civilian population. In this case, one of those precautions they've chosen to take is evacuation, or moving to so-called safe zones. Now, as the United Nations said a month ago, these zones cannot be humanitarian when they're unilaterally declared. In addition, under international law, when you evacuate people to a place, you must have sufficient resources for survival. Medical facilities, food and water. It sounds very obvious. We have not even heard lip service paid to medical facilities, food and water. So that is that these so-called safe zones are only safe when they're not only free from bombardment, but when those conditions, food, water, medicine and shelter, are met. However, under the current besieged conditions, adequate supplies for such zones are impossible. I saw this for myself. They are tiny patches of barren land, or they're street corners in neighbourhoods, or they're half-built buildings with no water, no facilities, no shelter from the cold and now the rain, and certainly no sanitation. Currently in Gaza, there is a toilet for around every 700 people. You can imagine the 3 or 4 hours that means for an adolescent girl. One toilet for 700 people. Relocate people from these shelters to the so-called safe zones, and we're talking about tens of thousands of people resorting to buckets or open defecation. And so without water, without sanitation, nor shelter, these so-called safe zones have become zones of disease. Diarrhea cases in children are now above 100,000. Acute respiratory illness in civilians above 150,000. Both these numbers will be gross undercounts of the woeful reality. Malnutrition is also soaring in Gaza's children. Therefore, things like diarrheal diseases are now deadly. Consider this. More than 130,000 of Gaza's most vulnerable children, that is newborns up to 2 years of age, are not receiving the critical life-saving breastfeeding or age-appropriate complementary feeding that they absolutely require. So that's our scenario. Without sufficient safe water, food and sanitation that only a humanitarian ceasefire would bring, child deaths due to disease could well surpass those already killed in bombardments. Now, parents are painfully aware that hospitals are not an option for their sick child, both because hospitals are, as we've mentioned, being hit, and because hospitals are utterly overwhelmed with children and citizens with ghastly wounds of war. As a parent who I became friends with, who sent me a message just a couple of days ago, of a critically sick little child told me, quote, "Our situation is pure misery. I'm overwhelmed. My son is very sick. I told my wife we have to lower expectations. All we have is hope. I don't know if we will make it through this. Please tell the world." Now, as we speak, the delivery of aid is a matter of life and death for children in Gaza, and the conditions to provide that aid are simply not being met. An immediate and long-lasting humanitarian ceasefire is the only way to end the killing and injuring of children and ensure the urgent delivery of desperately needed life-saving aid so we do not see thousands of children die from disease.